We're going to go ahead and get started. Yeah, we were
Yeah.
trying to figure out, is he coming? Is he able to come? So, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to start
My
off with
pleasure. Yeah. I don't know
awesome.
why I could not connect. I used various links you had sent me, but only now suddenly. I'm here. That's good.
Yes,
And
yes.
so
Awesome.
I have a large PowerPoint presentation if you want that, or we could have just a conversation, question and answer, whatever is your preference.
So, Dr. Classen, I'm going to go ahead and just start with an introduction.
Yep.
And so, what we're doing today for everyone who is joining us or will join us later, because we'll be posting this interview in this conversation, is that I'm going to do an introduction of the Michi and Walter Weglin, introduce Dr. Classen and our discussant for today, as well as our awesome administrative support coordinator, Melissa Ortiz, who's here, who has been working with us on every little nooks and crannies of the logistics, and really so thankful that she's still working with us on this. She's been with us for a while. So good afternoon, everyone. I am Mary Kamiyu Danico. I am the director of the Weglin Endowed Chair. And as a faculty early retire faculty member, I'm still lucky to be able to do this while I am retired, I guess. Um, but with me today is my esteemed colleagues, Jesse Vallejo, who was just announced as Yamaha's top 40 music educators in the nation from K through
Wow.
12. So really awesome. And also my esteemed award-winning colleague, Faye Wack, sociologist, who has written many books, but most recent one is about facial paralysis. And she will tell you a little bit about that later on when we get to it. But to save on time, I really want to save most of it for Dr. Classen, who I am so thankful to have us as a partner in this endeavor. And so I don't have the exact numbers, but to say that Dr. Classen is a prolific author and scholar is a major understatement. He is a distinguished professor and director of outreach at University of Arizona, where he's been there since 1987, shortly after he received his doctorate from University of Virginia. But the part that just blows my mind is that he has written, I believe, 227 books or 127 books, 227 articles, thousands of book reviews, couple thousands of book reviews, and luck for us, he had managed to find time to do the translation for Resi Weglein's memoir. I was introduced to Dr. Classen by a relative of his and my friend who I did not know, president of Olon College, Charles Sasaki. And I was looking for someone not who can just translate, but who's also a German scholar who understood the history of the Holocaust, but also understood the complexities and the nuances of the details when someone is going through a memoir and transcript. And so I was just so thankful that Dr. Classen could do this. And so I think if you do have a PowerPoint, we only have an hour, but if we can maybe spend about 30 minutes on the PowerPoint and then have Jesse and Faye have a conversation with you
Yeah,
afterwards,
that's great.
I think that would be great.
Yeah,
So,
wonderful.
so welcome so much to Cal Poly Pomona and our social justice series. And I do also want to talk a little bit about Michi and Walter. I think as the Michi and Walter Weglin Endowed Chair for Multicultural Studies started in the late 1990s, when they endowed it in 1998, a year after I started at Cal Poly Pomona, but I never really got to meet them. We were friends, then President Suzuki and Mrs. Suzuki were friends of Michi and Walter, and who left this endowment. And we've been doing a lot around Michi Weglin because she wrote The Year of Infamy, had a huge part in the redress for Japanese Americans who were interned. But we didn't really know much about Walter Weglin until Bob and Agnes gave us the memoir to translate. And we're focusing primarily on Walter's mother, And Walter was a survivor of the Holocaust, and Michi is a survivor of the Japanese internment. And together, they constantly fought for social justice. And having read some of the memoir and understanding a little bit more about Resi Weglein, I have a better understanding of why they were such human rights activists. And so I'm really thankful that Dr. Classen can shed more light to the story of the Wegleins, who Walter later changed his name to Weglin, but the original name is Weglein. So with that, Dr. Classen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. This is really a great honor, and I'm very, very pleased that you really asked me to do this, because it really was a very hard rendering thing, and yet so important also in terms of scholarship and in terms of the humanities, really. So I am originally from Germany. I emigrated more than 40 years ago. I was born after the war, but throughout my youth in high school and college, I learned a lot about the Nazis, Holocaust, of course, everyone did, but I've never really got so close as this document makes it possible. It's really very, very touching, moving, and also very painful. But at the same time, I always like to tell anyone who wants to listen to that because I was born after the war, I cannot really sort of be blamed for anything that happened during the war. So I have no guilt, but I have an obligation. And I feel really honored that you asked me to do this job, because it allowed me really to produce something of great significance. This is an absolutely monumental document. It seems very small and just by this nurse, but it sheds really incredible light on that entire situation. I have now a long PowerPoint, and I think best would be, and for the sake of time, that I just select a few of the images so that we all get a good sense. But before we proceed, I see on the top of my screen various options: OK or leave meeting. Of course, I don't want to leave the meeting. Should I click on the OK? Is that for the closed captioning, or should I just ignore it? Okay, then I will click on OK, and now we are good to go. So why don't I share the screen, and please confirm whether you can see that. Very good. All right. So I am, as a German scholar, very concerned with and interested in these questions, since I represent, as a professor of German studies, Germany, or the German-speaking world. Now, I have to tell you also that I am actually a medievalist. So I really work most of my books deal with the European, German and European Middle Ages in many different regards. But this was a very touching and very moving project, and I'm very thankful for the invitation. So really, my greatest gratitude that you allowed me to come in and to do this. That is, of course, my expertise. I am also working as a translator. And oddly enough, just about a year before I did this project, I did a translation for someone whose grandfather was a prisoner of war. So I translated that from German into English. So the war is simply a horrible, horrible situation. The Holocaust is even worse. Of course, I could talk at length about the Holocaust as such, but let's just look at her, Resi Weglein. I have learned very recently a lot of new things about the Holocaust, and I would like to share that briefly. There is a scholar called Königsberger, Richard Königsberger, whose work I am following, and he has analyzed at length war, the psychology of war, the Holocaust and the Nazi ideology. And I think he has really pinpointed in very precise way what the motivation might have been behind the whole horrible history. So just in a nutshell, he was reading Mein Kampf, Hitler's Mein Kampf, and other texts by the Nazis, and could determine that basically they were talking like modern day biologists. So Hitler, in a way, wanted to be the new Robert Koch. Robert Koch was the great German scholar, bacteriologist, who basically in the late 19th century discovered bacteria and viruses. And Hitler used his language, his concept, and applied that to the German people, the Aryan nation, whatever that might have meant, and wanted to cleanse the human body, the German body politics of the Jewish virus. And I think if we keep that in mind in those terms, it makes really good sense why they were so absolutely crazy during a war, investing billions of dollars trying to eliminate the entire German Jewish population. The point was, according to Königsberger, and who again draws directly from the original sources, to cleanse the German body. And the Jews were identified as bacteria and viruses that threatened the health of that body. As sick as that whole thing might be, that was then most effective and led to what Hannah Arendt has called very famously the banality of evil. You might have heard of Hannah Arendt, a very famous professor of sociology, emigrated from Germany, and she taught in New York. And most famously, she was then a witness of the Eichmann trials in New York and came back. You know, there was this famous movie, and she came back with this horrifying observation. This was the banality of evil. All these people involved in the Holocaust saw that simply as their jobs, as what they had to do according to the orders. And so they were just butchers as they were just told to be. One personal memory I have is I once visited Buchenwald, which is a concentration camp, elimination concentration camp just north of Weimar, a town in Thuringia. And, it was a horrible experience, of course, to see the ovens and the barracks and so forth. What really horrified me, and that stays with me until today and for the rest of my life, and you might be surprised, were the houses of the guards, the kindergartens, and the petting zoos. And you might wonder why? What is strange about that? What horrified me was that these guards who killed people every day by the thousands were ordinary fathers, husbands, and they came back from their job and killing people and came home, and then they were good fathers, husbands, and the ordinary life of those people right outside of the camp. This is unbelievable. The horrors that I witnessed there will stay with me. Now, the other thing about Resi is, let me just go quickly to a couple of other sites. The other component which I find so important, and this diary, or the memoirs rather, will serve that purpose really well. Germany, at least post-war, has tried really hard to come to terms with that shameful history. I think Germany is the one country in the world that I really believe that has done more to come to terms with that horror than any other country. So I'm showing you here the famous Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which is very moving because you have all these black stones growing in size. The deeper you go in, with not one word on them, no dates, nothing. It is a silent ocean of stones that ask you to remember. That is really phenomenal. And here is another scene. I have never had any visitor or student with me who would not have been deeply moved or maybe even cried seeing that memorial. Then the other thing, which is extremely important, are the so-called Stolpersteine. So an artist, a German artist, started doing something most remarkable because the history of the Holocaust depends on our memory. It is just like the history of the internment camps. You know, Mary, you mentioned that we are connected through my wife's relative, and we have two internment camps here in Arizona, and our job today is to remember. And so that is extremely important. And the same thing with the Stolpersteine. So the artist identified houses where Jewish German people lived, and he sort of determined their destiny and created these plaques or these blocks, which were then inserted into the pavement with some dates so that people kind of stumble. That's what Stolper means. Stumble over history, should pass in their daily walks and start thinking about it. Here is another one, more detailed. I give you the translation. Here lived Max Meyer, born in 1873, representative of the SPD, Social Democratic Party, I'm not quite sure which town that is, probably Berlin. He was apprehended in 1933, was in a prison in Freiburg in 1938 in Dachau, but he managed to escape in 1939 and fled via Switzerland, Spain, to the United States, and he survived, überlebt. And that's the same thing with his wife. So they both managed to get away and survived. This one, however, Samuel Preminger, he was expelled from Germany in 1938 to Poland, apprehended, and then murdered in 1941. The details, further details are unclear, but it says on a special Sunday when a lot of people were killed, maybe in Warsaw. I'm not sure about this. And here we come to a very clear case. This person was sent to the concentration camp in Dachau, and then he was deported in 1940 to Gurs, which is in France, and then later sent to Auschwitz, where he was murdered. Now, Dachau is just like, or was just like Theresienstadt. There were thousands of these camps, as you can see here. This is mind-boggling. If you see, of course, most of those camps in Western Germany, even Central Germany, were not really decimation camps. Those camps were, or KZs, KZs, were in Czech Republic, in Poland, in Lithuania, in Latvia, and so or Estonia, so far away, so out of people's sight. But an incredible effort in organization to systematically eliminate about 6 million people. So we have all the evidence, and Resi's memoirs are so important, particularly for us today in the United States. You know, there are really many people, and I find it horrible to say, who deny the Holocaust. And they say that's all made up. It is all sort of theory, and nothing is true. But crazy finding. I mean, that's if you need any further evidence. I mean, it's mind-boggling for me. But Resi's memoirs are the most impressive documentation. Couple of major points that really stand out in that memoir. So she and her husband survived 3 years of horror and death. But I have to say one more time, it was like Dachau, not a decimation camp. So the prisoners were not there, not to be killed, but just to be kept, and then they were sent off, transited mostly to Auschwitz. But one of the major features that come through Resi's diary, or memoir, I should say, is that they primarily had taken older people. And of course, under those horrendous living conditions, many of them died, of course, starvation, typhoid, and so forth. Why? And okay, this is also very interesting. So this is the map that gives you the sense of where that little town is, Theresienstadt. So you have the borderline there, Dresden, that's Germany, Chemnitz is Germany, and you see here there's Bavaria, Hof, and so forth. So there's a border, the modern day borderline, there's the mountains, and this town here, Theresienstadt, Pamatnik Terezin, that's where the camp was. Now, for me, this is personally very moving because there is a little town north of that, Ustinat Labem, or in German, Aussig. And I have several colleagues there or in the vicinity, and some of them have come here to Tucson to some of my conferences. And I had no idea until I started working on the memoirs that Theresienstadt was just south of it. It's about 30 miles south of Usti. So a very strange coincidence. So 2 years ago, last time I was in Usti, and we went to Teplice and other places, and they told me, yes, there's Theresienstadt, and I didn't even know. And now I'm aware. So next time I have to see it. So it's about 2 hours north of Prague, which was all at that time German controlled. But it was a collection camp. And so poor Resi noted that all these people, Dutch people or Czech people or Danish people who were shipped into that camp, barely surviving, but it was a transit camp. And so from there, then she observes this with horror that they were sent into their death. She knew that. And so ultimately, she does what we all do right now with her help. She wrote her memoirs so that people can maybe or could find names of people who were taken to that camp and maybe at least connect, because that's really what we're all about as human beings. We need connections, we need family, and it is the worst thing if a loved one just disappears, missing in action, if you will, in the military terms, but not knowing what happened with these people in those camps. One thing that I would like to emphasize, this is a bit of too much information, but these are the facts here. She comes from a town in Ulm. So there were around 500 Jews living in Ulm. But when I say Jews, then there's something really wrong about that. They were Germans with of Jewish faith. So whether we want to call them as a Jewish race or not, they were Germans. And her husband, for example, was a highly decorated soldier in the First World War. So he earned the Iron Cross, which is one of the key motivators why Resi and her husband did not flee. They believed that they would be safe. See here, for example, on November 9th, 1938, there was the Kristallnacht, the Crystal Night, when the Nazis started attacking Jewish stores, businesses, synagogues, destroying them. So kind of early signals, we will kill you all. We don't quite yet have the ultimate order, but we are going and we are coming for you. The Resi and her husband did not emigrate despite all the warning signs because they believed her husband was a war hero and the Nazis would spare them. But they were not spared, of course not. So 116 Jews from Ulm were then deported. 45 were sent to Theresienstadt, and only 4 who had survived returned. So the book we translated altogether, published in 1968, confirms that at that time only 25 Jews were living in Ulm. Now, quickly, an irony of history. In 2024, we have today a steady stream of Jews from Russia immigrating back or into Germany. Why? Because Jews today, Russian Jews, experience increasingly pogroms, persecutions, maybe even killing. So they return to the country of the Holocaust. So a very strange situation, but I welcome this very much because I think that is wonderful that maybe situation will change in the future. Quickly, a map so that we all know what we're talking about. That is Ulm. Munich is to the southeast, Stuttgart to the northwest, Switzerland is to the south there. So frankly, they could have easily escaped into Switzerland and then somehow via Switzerland, then Spain, escaped and have gone to maybe Brazil or the United States. They did not do that. So here are a couple of quotes. There's a lot. I don't want to repeat all that. But one of the things that she was saying that makes her memoirs so moving, here, that's the back cover, so moving. Resi was saying, and I have this sometime later, you see some of these images, horrendous images, that her whole principle of life was to serve people. So she worked as a nurse, and her entire impetus and desire what to do was to help people. So she says at one point, I hope I can find this statement, that's not yet, but her whole meaning of life consisted of helping other people. So she was, I would say she was a saint. She was really, truly a saint who committed 3 years of her entire existence helping people to come to survive. And so she says here, I finally found it, to live for something is everything. So life in itself is nothing, but to live for something is everything. So she was an absolute idealist. And with that idealism, she managed to survive those 3 horrible years. She does not really say much about herself and even less about her husband. And I want to end with this brief slide because the text that she composed is almost also ironic because she makes fun of herself and says here, that is my translation, the Nazis, the Gestapo, or whoever took from my purse cologne and chocolate. But my watch, which I had knotted into a bloody handkerchief during our transport, was the only thing I found left behind. And then she says, what irony! Jewish blood is good for something. Well, how can you say that? In the face of massive dying and death, she still kept a certain sense of humor. And that makes this whole text so incredibly moving. It is really a very personal documentation, and allows us really to engage in a most emotional, personal way the Holocaust. I think I leave it at this point. I have lots of more pictures, and I think I want to leave that with one final pictures that I took in Germany. I was in Hamburg, and to my great delight, I found a testimony basically pertaining to the Weglein children, because they survived, those who endowed the chair. And in Hamburg, they created this memorial outside of one of their train stations dedicated to the children's transport. And that's what they then have. So they showed here then these poor children who never saw their parents again. And so the city of Hamburg wants all the busy travelers who go in and out of that train station to remember these children. I was, however, the only person who ever stopped on my way to the conference, and I was the only person to take a photo. But I'm sensitized through the Resi's memoirs. And I think I leave that up right now. In a way, we see depicted the sons, Walter, for example, some of the very few children who fled to Holland and then survived. So I think I've talked for half an hour, and I think that might be good to stop at this point. I have, of course, lots more material, and I think I would just open the floor right now. And let me say one more time, Mary, thank you so much for allowing me to do this job. This really has meant a lot for me, it has really touched me very deeply. And I feel deeply honored as a formerly German, that I was allowed to make this text, this book available, which, by the way, consists of two parts. One is her memoirs, and the other one is also extremely interesting, namely an historical analysis why this anti-Semitism emerged in Germany and how it then became worse and worse until 1938 and the following years. So, with almost a heavy heart, but very happy at the same time, I end here for right now, and we can then have a session of question and answers. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. If we can stop sharing the screen, I'm not sure who, I don't know if,
I do that.
okay,
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you so much. And I know that the body of the memoir is mass. It's quite intense. So I appreciate you taking the time to have some discussion with my esteemed colleagues, Jesse Vale and Faye Wax. So Jesse and Faye, I'm going to leave it to you to have the conversation.
And then, I don't know, did you want to start first, Faye, or?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to thank you both for starting such an important discussion. And as you alluded to, it's something that's a difficult discussion, but a necessary discussion to have. And I actually, what you just said about the historic roots of the anti-Semitism and allowing it to emerge in those particular ways, I actually would be fascinated to hear a little bit about. That wasn't my intended question, but when you just said that, I got very interested in that side of the research.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Shall I respond to that right away? Because that's really fascinating.
Sure. I mean, I have a question after, and I want to say thank you too. And but I would love to hear your response, and we'll see if anybody submits more questions.
So, on the one hand, we're facing a very dangerous scholarly approach, because we know, of course, that in the Middle Ages, the Christians were anti-Semitic already. And we have already in the Middle Ages pogroms, murder, we have host desecration, we have the charge of blood libel, and I can explain these things later, which then led to pogroms and so forth. But some historians have tried, Jonah Goldhagen, for example, have tried to argue that there was a direct connection from the Middle Ages to 1933, 1938, and 1941, and so forth. I find that problematic, and I rather rely on the historical discussion provided by the two editors of the German edition of Weglein's book. In short, they observe something really significant, and I think there's a almost perturbing analogy to our own time. We live today in a time of a paradigm shift. We know that our world is changing, whether you think of AI, internet, and so forth. And we also live at a time when the United States are changing demographically. We have more brown babies being born than white babies, for example. There are a lot of anxieties in our country for the last, by now, about 10 years. And so we have much more forms of violence than in the past, I dare say. And I think one of the major reasons is the fear about the paradigm shift. When there's a paradigm shift, the social structures changing, demographics change, people are looking for scapegoats. So when you think about, Japanese Americans, for example, if you think about the Chinese Americans, how they were persecuted, whenever there was a paradigm shift, Black Americans persecuted, Native American Indians persecuted, and so forth and so forth. In the 19th, particularly the late 19th centuries, we have a major paradigm shift affecting Central Europe, Western Europe. On the one hand, you have the Industrial Revolution taking on a new pace and intensity. Secondly, you have a dramatic growth of cities and hence a steady movement or migration of Jews from the countryside into cities. That led also to a remarkable change of the economic conditions. We have suddenly a transition from a much more traditional, let's say, craftsmanship-based economy to increasingly manufacturing industry and increasingly industrial production. In the case of the Wegleins, this is beautifully illustrated. They ran basically a textile store right next to a major, much more traditional textile store, which was the first in the town. And there was a major difference. The traditional store, much bigger, much more accepted by the public, had a firm chain of deliveries. And they did not purchase from the textile industry. The Wegleins were the proponents or the first ones to follow the change of times, and they had much more turnover of their fabrics or their fashions, clothing, whatever. And so they reflected increasingly a new type of economy. And I can confirm myself from many comments by elderly people back in Germany who lived through those years as young people, that there was a deep sense of suspicion, fear, honestly, real fear of them being taken over by the rich Jews. And so there was very quickly the general arguments, all the banks, insurances, newspapers, and big businesses, department stores, all were owned by the Jews. And hence there was a deep sense amongst the population, the ordinary population, that Jews were threatening their economic existence. And the Nazis only needed to tap into that reservoir of anti-Semitic feeling, blew the air in or fanned the flames, a little glimmer of glow, and to flame up the entire thing, so that the population never really cared about the massive operations against the Jews. So that's one of the major reasons, I believe. Economic fear. Secondly, religious conflicts, of course, but also we should never forget that fear, naked fear, because the Nazis were much more effective, and pardon me if I make a political allusion, they were much more effective than the January 6th rioters. Thank God those rioters were incompetent and had not the foggiest idea how to do something like that. Hitler and his people, they knew how to do that. And as soon as they had power, they took over the entire police force. They took over all radio stations. They took over all newspaper publications and had hence complete control over the public. And once then the Reichstag, the parliament building, burned, there was sort of somebody who tried, a Dutch man, who tried to burn it, and therefore they had suddenly the justification and could fan the flames and thereby take over the government very rapidly, and then the rest is then basically history. So I think this book also by the historians provides wonderful in-depth information about the growth of anti-Semitic feelings and of anti-Semitic organizations in Ulm since 1825. And then that is always in place. People can always draw back from their arguments, the ideology, whenever they face economic crisis. You know, remember the Black Monday, world crisis, world inflation. And so who is at fault? Of course, the Jews. That's the same pattern of arguments. Stereotypes always work better than critical thinking. So, okay, but I rest at this point. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
I feel like one of the slides and one of the things you mentioned that stuck with me the most so far is how Resi Weglein talked about the imprisonment, psychosis, and the horror in her soul. And I know you alluded to her using humor and being idealistic and serving people or serving an idea as parts of how she survived all of this. I think, you know, a lot of times we focus so much on the, you know, body and like the us staying alive, but I think the real harm can be psychological. And so I would love to know more about your reflections on surviving that.
Yeah, that is what fascinated me as well the whole time when I translated this. And one thing that I observed was that she had found a very pragmatic way of handling the psychological stress. She realized she needed to work to help people to get food, to help people to get toilets, to help people get clean clothing, and basically just to survive. She had the sense of a nurse, and I think she was a nurse through and through, and understood that her job of life, her purpose of life was to nurse. And that allowed her to divert from all the daily horror and work. Just, you know, concretely daily work. What do I have to do? How do we get the mattresses down from the 3rd floor to the 1st floor? How do we provide water? So she was really busy the whole time. She did not write the memoirs during her time. She was too exhausted. She was dead tired. She worked really incessantly and tirelessly to help constantly these people, young and old. And she faced, of course, death all the time, not murder. These people were just simply dying in Theresienstadt because of lack of food or nutrition in general or sleep and so forth. So this was a very interesting psychological method to divert attention away from the daily, well, not, you know, she turned to the daily grind and could thereby cope with the psychological pressure or really torture in a way. Yeah, so I think that is a very interesting way. I think for many people, even today, if you're unstressed, just work. That solves a lot of things.
Thank you so much.
And by the way, that's the same, I think, what happened in the internment camps, Mary. I think that's what they did as well. My wife, her father was almost a victim, relatives were victims, and so forth. And so what we know is that these people in the internment camps, particularly here in the desert or in Montana, so they just try to live and to build maybe handmade air conditionings, teaching, art a little bit, just to fill time, educate, play music, play games. Just sort of an irony. Let me just divert quickly for one moment, because I learned this just recently. There was this camp north of Tucson, and of course the young men played baseball. And so they wanted to have a competition. So at one point, the Tucson baseball team was allowed to travel there and they had a competition. But the Japanese Americans were not allowed to leave the camp and to play here in Tucson, just sort of as a side note. Okay. So they did a lot of similar things as much as they could, but they were mostly older people. And so it was really a nursing task she had to face.
Yeah, thank you so much. One of the things you brought up were the ways in which stories get memorialized in public space. And you showed the picture of the statue that had caused you to stop. And I was thinking about how